you very much, and also thanks a lot for the invitation. My perspective is kind of twofold, why this is very interesting for me and what my bias will be in the remarks in the next 10 minutes. On the one hand, of course, global governance as such, even though I come more from the security area, or did focus more on security, United Nations system and so on. It's clear since the financial crisis that the relation and the feedback loop between financial stability, but also the focus on not only global growth and national growth, but individual well-being, which can have, if that's not pursued, negative effects on security, becomes even wider. Secondly, though, my interest also on EU-IMF relations stems from the fact that I cooperated with Dirk and Sylvie on the European Parliament wide studies on the EU's role in global economic governance, and co-authored the article for the Parliament on EU-IMF relations. So a couple of points, and I think it's worth going very briefly back to the purpose of global governance, which is, Dirk, you referred to maybe the danger of boring people with the topic, but there's also a danger, I think, with global governance to end up in discussions that are very philosophical, become very artificial and very macro level. But if we think back to 1992, when Boutros Ghali, the UN Secretary General at the time, was convening the first commission on global governance. Before that, the term didn't even exist, in a spirit of optimism of, the liberal moment in world politics, and in an idea of trying to address collectively problems that cross national boundaries. It's a completely different setting and world as 2017. Nevertheless, I really urge not only my students, but everyone in any discussion when I have the opportunity to go back to the report of 1995. After 3 years, it was finally published, called Our Global Neighborhood, which is the report of the Commission on Global Governance, which essentially established the term and set, in many ways, the agenda. And if we go back now 27 years back, many of those issues outlined there in very good detail, very prescient ways, and in very creative recommendations could be applied today. Already then, not only did we talk about global inequality, rising inequality, the problem also of dealing with poverty, on the security side, nuclear proliferation, but also problems of radicalization, Islamic terrorism. But we also had already focuses on the impact of the internet, believe it or not, in 1995, and cyber governance and so on and so forth. But the context was one of optimism. And of course, in 2017, and I don't have to remind anyone in this room that this kind of optimism of a liberal moment and possibilities of cooperation and the role and effectiveness of both global organizations, where the IMF really is still one of the key focus points, and regional effectiveness of where the EU is still seen, or at that time more strongly seen as a bedrock, is maybe in doubt. Secondly, I think it's worth looking back at the EU's own approach to global governance, and that also is a quick reminder. In 2003, which I think was one of the strongest moments of the EU, it was just 1 year before the Big Bang enlargement, massive optimism. Some people even would say a little bit drunk on its own success. The European security strategy focused on its own version of global governance, which was called, a bit complicated, effective multilateralism. And what did that mean? Again, in a very self-confident way, Solana said that the EU's role in global governance is to strengthen the international organizations, such as the UN and the IMF or the International Criminal Court, to make them work better and more effectively. So it was not well received by all international organizations. They saw it as a bit of an arrogant way of thinking that the EU could be the one that could improve other organizations when there's still lots of problems in their own backyard and own courtyard. But that was the optimism then. And again, effective multilateralism every now and then just will still pop up in documents, and references will be made. Yet, not only are the international organizations themselves very much under pressure, but the EU itself, it was already mentioned by some other speakers, that the EU, yes, focuses a lot on internal problems, but these internal problems are also on the rise. So of course the EU has to make sure it has still a steady and strong look at trying to apply effective policies outside and really making a contribution to global economic governance on concrete issues. But it's undeniable that the internal pressures and the first case of a rollback of integration at the member state level will pose certain problems and certain questions that might incapacitate the EU as well for a couple of years now to again focus on the external and global issues. The key thing I think to hit home here is that global economic governance is a very nice and big word, but again the individual level of that concept is very important. If the individual does not feel empowered, in wealth increase, the economic situation, the security situation of you and I in any corner of the globe being increased, then there is no sense to talk about global governance or the sense of organizations' role in promoting this. So we see this, of course, again, I don't need to go into much detail on the rise of populism, the rise of anti-expertism. I think that will be another wave that will just be added to the anti-globalization movement. The IMF, which relies on expertise, I think, and our study also showed that the level of economic expertise and policy expertise is very high, even though it didn't result in correct predictions of the financial crisis. I mean, still in 2006, you had reports that really was full of optimism and did not have one single reference to structural problems or possibilities of a financial crisis. That expertise itself is not going to win votes, and it's not going to turn a wave of populist skepticism that's sweeping across the Western pillars of a liberal global economic order in any way in an effective manner. The key thing, I think, and it was hinted at before, it's always good to have policies and design them and have policy frameworks, but it's always at the implementation and the revision of policies when they don't work. I think it's moved in the back of our minds now in terms of attention, but the biggest problem is not so much how the EU is represented in the IMF, whether we are, whether we move from a state-centric approach to the IMF, have a single to an inter-organizational one, i.e., allowing the EU to have its own seat as an organization in the IMF. I think coordination issues can always be sorted out at the more informal level, at the working staff to working staff level. Yes, it would make things easier, but the key problem is what's the joint output. What's the joint impact of a regional organization such as the EU and a global organization such as the IMF on the citizen? So all the issues of transparency that was mentioned, very, very important. Accountability, which means predictable policy making. It also means non-arbitrary policy making, and also knowing who to hold account in policy making that affect the individual citizens are of key importance. And I think the lessons learned review of the EU IMF policy towards Greece has not even begun yet. It is a major problem because it shows that for the first time a regional organization and a global organization such as the IMF have worked together in an unprecedented way, but also they had very divergent towards the end of the first wave of the program, divergent views on how to handle the economic crisis and the kind of rebuilding of the Greek economy. And that in itself has, of course, had clear impacts on populist movements and a big knock-on effect also on elites in other countries. Just as a footnote, many discussions of elites and previously pro-European elites in Britain also always referred to the Greek case as one of the reasons why they in the end shifted and went strongly in terms of their opinion in favor of Brexit. So the perception that the EU itself against IMF policies is, in terms of debt restructuring, created unfavorable situations in Greece, had also not only impact on Greece itself, but also on the Brexit discussion and on the effectiveness, legitimacy, and, in a sense, democratic approach of the European Union in economic governance. in that sense, when something so opaque, such as an international organization that itself relies a lot on informality in decision making, but also in terms of an cooperation with a regional organization and with member states' interests, sometimes even hijacking processes, the issue of transparency becomes ever more important. I think the European Parliament's role, and we put this front up in the report, can really at least mitigate some of these problems. The involvement of civil society organizations, especially expertise that you can bring in of major NGOs that popped up in the aftermath of the financial crisis, but also frequent hearings, filling the gap between accountability processes at the national level and in Washington. In all these aspects, actually, the European Parliament could play a very, very important role of holding decision makers accountable and having a cross-party committee, for example, on global economic governance. Finally, in terms of improving, and that's more at the micro level now, improving cooperation and coordination flows. There are many, many initiatives that have been brought back from the IMF side. For example, the European office of the IMF, which was located in Paris and had a small Brussels branch, which was closed down in 2004, has been reopened. A lot of information flow possibilities and coordination under the high politics level are completely possible there. I think quite a lot of issues otherwise have been dealt with, and I think in the interest of time and for questions, I leave it here.